Hello, welcome to another episode of Ocean Steward Spotlight. My name is Brady Bradshaw, and I'm joined by Aisha WallacePalomares. And I just wanted to tell a little bit more about the purpose of this project. We are working with Oceana to highlight ocean stewards from diverse backgrounds to create a more welcoming ocean conservation community, to deepen and broaden our movement. And the series is sort of a commitment, if you will, from Oceana's field team to raise visibility for Black, Indigenous, people of color, especially women, folks from the LGBTQ community, religious minorities, and really just to paint a more accurate picture of the folks who are on the ground doing the work to protect our oceans and protect our climate. So we are joined by Aisha today, who I know personally, and I'm really excited to have you on board for this. Thanks for joining us. And yeah, so I wanted to start out with just diving right into having you tell us a little bit more about yourself, Aisha. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about how we met throughout the course of this program. But what's sort of a defining moment for you in your life where you fell in love with the ocean, or where you decided that you wanted to be involved in this kind of work?
Yeah, so great question. I'm super excited to be here. Just growing up in SoCal, I just have so many memories of just going to the beach with my friends and family. So I can't really pinpoint one exact moment, but I feel like a defining moment for me that really got me into environmentalism was going to Nicaragua. I'm half Mexican and half Nicaraguan, and just kind of seeing how beautiful of a place it was, but like also like seeing the flip side of how much like waste and litter was just everywhere. Like it was, there'd be like on the side of the road like a lot of like trash burning, and it's just because like the solid waste municipal system isn't like how it is here in the States. And so, that litter is out on the side of the road, but then it ends up in drainage canals and makes its way to the ocean. And so it was really heartbreaking to see just so much litter in, drainage canals, in the waterways, in the ocean. And, also in Managua, the largest open air landfill in Central America is located there. And there's, people who literally live within the landfill and make a living from, sorting the waste. And so it really opened my eyes to the problem of overconsumption that we have globally, and, the epidemic of single-use plastics specifically, because that's what most of the litter that ends up in the ocean and the waterways is.
Yeah, and it's sort of would you say, like a privilege and a burden to be part of one of the countries that contributes in a large part to the problem of plastic pollution. And a lot of our waste is end up sent overseas to countries that don't have systems like we do. And when in reality, like our systems, sometimes the systems that we believe or imagine exist actually only exist to ship plastic waste overseas and dump them on other countries. So, I think this is a great point you bring up, and it's a really, it sounds like a really intense experience to have.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that, I think, growing up in the US, we're like, fed this narrative that, recycling is the solution. And like when you use like plastic, like all you do is recycle it, and like it ends up in a bin, but like people don't really think about what happens after. Like there is no throw away. Like it doesn't just go away. It ends up somewhere. And, that somewhere is frontline communities in Asia that we, send most of our waste to. And, they don't have the infrastructure to deal with the waste that we send. And it's really heartbreaking because, we just don't have consciousness around that. And especially with, Operation National Sword in 2018, the system that, we were calling the recycling system, just is in crisis now. And, we really need to reckon with the fact that plastic is not sustainable in any form, and we need to really reduce our consumption.
It's really heartening to hear you talk about these things. I remember when I first met you, Aisha, it was in a city council meeting in Escondido, and just didn't expect it. I saw you stand up and speak about some of the things that were happening at the global scale, and you were actually involved in the offshore drilling campaign that we were working on, and you spoke about offshore drilling and the impacts to the climate. And a lot of your work has revolved around climate change. So can you talk a little bit more about how the issues of climate change and plastic pollution and offshore drilling are connected to your community in Escondido, even though, Escondido is slightly inland?
Right, yeah. So, even though I'm from an inland community, I think, the way that I see it is, everything is connected. Like, we're part of this, ecosystem that, connects all of us. So the actions that we make impact, Black people's lives, like immediately, like near us, but also like we were talking about earlier, like people in like on other parts of the world. And so, like the waterways and so like an example is like, okay, so whatever like litter ends up in like Escondido Creek, like that creek is connected to a waterway that takes it all the way to the ocean. So like any litter that gets into that creek is going to eventually make its way to the ocean. So therefore, any policy that is made at the local level in Escondido that addresses, single-use plastics reduction will have an impact on the amount of waste that ends up in the ocean. And so, if Escondido were to adopt a single-use plastic ordinance, then there would be less plastic in circulation, which would then mean there's less plastic waste getting in the waterways, therefore reducing the amount of plastic waste eventually making its way to the ocean. So, even though we're an inland community, our actions affect the ocean. And, I think a lot of people kind of like lose sight of that, but, we're all just connected. And with offshore oil drilling, there is no boundaries with air. Like, let's say that, this offshore oil drill is emitting toxins, like on a very windy day, those toxins can make it all the way inland to Escondido residents. So, therefore that offshore oil drilling is directly affecting the air quality of Escondido residents. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there's so many. It's in the quote unquote environmental movement, which I even hesitate to call it that. Right? We talked about this a little while ago. As the nature of this work is so interconnected. The nature of the ocean is so interconnected. It's one and the same, connected to our climate and connected to communities. And what comes out of the ground underneath the ocean ends up in the air, not just in the coastal areas, but impacting the climate all around the globe. So I think it's sort of the beauty and the difficulty of the movement is sort of identifying how to best address these issues, right?
Right. Yeah. And, most of the work that I've done revolves around, climate action and climate justice, but, climate change is something that affects everything. Oceans are a carbon sink, and, they really have taken on the brunt of of absorbing CO2 in the atmosphere. And so, that, we can see the direct effects of anthropogenic climate change, with the coral reefs dying. I think a New York Times article that came out last fall said that half of the Great Barrier Reef had been bleached. And, that's just like one example of, something that is happening globally with the coral reefs. And it's super important, to like see that, you know, coral only makes up 1% of sea life, but it is responsible for the life of 25% of marine life. So if that one, like if the coral reef, if that one species, you know, collapses, then it's going to directly affect so many other organisms in the ocean, and that's going to, you know, lead to bigger effects that we're going to feel. And so, you know, climate change is a major part of ocean conservation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um, so I want to ask a question because this is these issues can be overwhelming to folks who are just getting involved. And I want to ask a question to our viewers. We have folks who maybe are already involved in some of the work, and then some who are simply looking for a way to plug in. What would you say to people who really love the ocean so much and want to help, but don't necessarily know what steps they can take to protect it?
Great question. Right. So, you know, we're all starting at different levels, and you know, it's a little bit overwhelming at first. It's like you have this passion, but like you don't know what to do with it. And, you know, I was 15 when I started getting into environmentalism, and I was so overwhelmed and I didn't know what to do. But, you know, the first thing that I did personally was to just start researching, started to read articles and books, and just really like educate myself on you know, the issues that were prevailing in the environmental community. So that's one super concrete thing you can do, is just learn as much as you can. Um, but also, you know, I think, you know, where the real action takes place is when, you know, you show up to city council meetings, you identify who represents you, and you see where they stand on the issues that you care about. You can, you know, lobby your representatives, meet with them, and just be like, hey, like I'm a constituent of yours, and I'm really passionate about getting a single-use plastic ordinance in Escondido, and you know, I would really like to have a conversation about this and to take action on this. And so, you know, you can also get involved with orgs like Oceana, and you know, volunteer with their campaigns, and you know, also just talk to the people around you. Talk to your parents, to your brothers, to your sister, to your friends. You know, that's spreading awareness and it's spreading action. And you know, I think the most important thing is to get involved, and to not, you know, not be scared. Like it's new and it's overwhelming sometimes, but you know, we all go through it, and you'll be happy that you took action in the end.
Yeah, you've taken some massive action. I would call it massive action. Word I like to use in organizing the first ever San Diego Youth Climate Action Summit. I would say that's one thing that when I think of youth action, I think of Aisha. So can you talk about this sort of what you see as being some of the most important ways that you know, getting people together for climate action can help benefit the oceans? And I want to actually go a little bit more into your vision for the future as well. Like, so when you're doing this work, it can be maybe not so inspiring to just think, oh, I would love to meet my council member. I mean, that's not something that a lot of people get super excited about. But is there a future that you envision that you kind of hold in your vision when you do this work? It's really important work.
Right. Yeah, so on the first part, so yeah, I organized a youth climate action summit. I think it was back in 2019. And you know, it was just great to, you know, I felt like I was missing a community of young people who were motivated and passionate about climate action. So I wanted to create the space for that, where there previously was not a space for that in San Diego, as far as like the research that I had done. And trust me, I had looked for programs. And so I was like, okay, so what can I do about it? You know, and, you know, we were able to organize that event, and it was wonderful to just meet people who are as passionate as I was at the time. and those connections like still persist to today. Like I still talk to a lot of the youth that I met with at that summit. So it's really great to see that legacy. Um, but as far as like taking action on climate change, will directly affect ocean conservation. Anthropogenic climate change, has resulted in, the warming of the oceans, which has led to coral bleaching, which is, leading to all of these major ramifications for the rest of, the marine community. And so, and those actions, affect like the livelihood of people who rely on the ocean for sustenance and their livelihood. And so, any action that, really limits the amount of carbon dioxide or methane emissions will, help to protect, ocean life. And so they're really intricately connected, I would say. And so as far as, you know, like what is the overall vision, like what keeps me kind of going, like what am I striving towards, I really envision a future where, we have justice at the core of, the policies that we're making, and justice at the core of the communities that we have. And honestly, like just bringing back community, I feel like community is something that we've kind of lost, and like over the past couple hundred years, and really just bringing it back to building community, building solidarity, taking back our systems, really centering on justice. And, the way that I see that happening is, like, for example, like localizing our food systems again, working on like having a community garden. Like, I really want to see equity at the center of our policies, not just equality, because, people start at different places. And so we really need to do the work to make sure, everyone has access to the same resources. Um, so, what I'm fighting for, a future where climate change is, acknowledged and addressed and mitigated and, prepared for, and, really doing the most that we can at every level to, stop this existential crisis. Um, and so, I have hope. It's difficult sometimes. It's not easy. Um, but just being a part of a community, talking to other people who are as passionate as I am, really gives me resilience to continue, this fight, because it's not going to come easy, and it's not going to come fast. It's, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So, we just have to build community and support each other, because without each other, like this work is impossible.
Right. And it could be a little discouraging for folks who are working on building community to live in a paradigm where the climate is collapsing around us. It's like, what's the point in building community when our climate and our oceans can't provide for our communities? So I definitely see that you are not only interested in sort of scoring climate points, but also, building genuine community. I see the work that you're doing in Escondido. You went with your mom to, and some folks in the local group around to a bunch of different restaurants in the community to talk directly with folks who are like Mexican restaurant owners, for example, directly, and build relationships, which I thought was a really powerful thing, because a lot of the time in the environmental sort of movement or work that some folks do, you can skip over that step of building strong relationships. So I really appreciate that about you, that you put in the work to build community and get to understand people and where they are, because that's the kind of work that lasts a lot longer than just meeting a goal and then moving on from it, and sort of using a certain municipality or a certain voice for a benefit and then moving on. So
Right.
inspiring.
Yeah. Yeah. On that point, I feel like what keeps me, doing the work is like the friendships that I've, built, over the past 5 years is, just they keep me going. And, it's not just like it's not just a strategy for like mobilizing. It's like building genuine connections and coalitions like will keep you wanting and motivated to stay in this fight. And it will also, like have that you will build that relationship with people who have been, sidelined from the environmental movement for such a long time. And, I think, you know, going with my mom to, almost every Mexican restaurant in Escondido and, you know, talking to them about, single-use plastics reduction and their thoughts on it and, really just listening to them is super important. It's not, I think, historically, like the environmental movement has done a lot of speaking for people, not really listening to the people who are most affected. So that's something that I've seen beginning to change, and it's a good change, and we need to continue that momentum.
Yeah, and thank you for sort of leading the way here locally with that. We have a goal in mind to get an ordinance passed in Escondido, and I know that we want to get it done. And I appreciate the fact that this isn't just about doing that. It's also about these long-term relationships and really just being a part of where you're from, right? Like you grew up in Escondido, and I can tell that you care about the people who live there. You don't want to see people impacted negatively. So it's
Right.
really empowering thing to do that.
Right. I think for me, like, at first when I got into environmentalism, I had this really like national global perspective of, wow, like we are dealing with these things and they're so big and so overwhelming. But what you can do to address them is like, work at the local level. Like that's your community. You can do things in your community. You can help pass ordinances and policies that will make that will like, affect the greater society. And so, one example of that is, working on this climate action plan and working with the city staff to make recommendations and really mold this policy that we're working on currently, that hopefully we have, some language around plastics reduction, and that's still kind of, on like on the edge. But it's really like what you can do is literally just get involved in your local government, and you will see like your direct impact, because sometimes like the work that you do feels very abstract and kind of like intangible, and you don't see the direct effects, but you can really see direct effects at the local level.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit earlier in the conversation about how the streams and rivers from Escondido and the kind of waste input from inland communities can end up in the ocean, right? So yeah, the impact flows in one direction, and we talked a little bit more about the climate impacts of what happens to the ocean and what gets pulled out of it, impacting more of the inland places and all over the world as well. Politically, it seems like there's a parallel, right? Like people who, well, from what I see in my position, people who are working at the local level are the ones that end up impacting federal legislation, even though that may not have been the initial intention, or maybe not everyone knew that that's what they were doing. But with the work that we've been involved in together, there's no question that the work that's been done locally has impacted the national conversation. So I think there's this ecosystem of what happens with our waste in the ocean, and there's also a political ecosystem that we get to learn more and more about through the years working on this stuff.
Yeah, that's so true. I feel like, once, a multiple local jurisdictions, take action, that'll create like sort of momentum across the state level. And then once more states start taking action, then, it's going to create this like national impact. And so, it's just, there is definitely a parallel there.
Yeah, and given that we're talking about community building and justice in the lens of the work that is being done in the environmental, climate, ocean conservation movements, what else are there? Any other sort of visions or recommendations that you see as ways that this movement can continue to improve, and like what's a little more of your vision for inclusion and diversity in the larger picture as well?
Right. So, I think, the environmental movement has not always been a welcoming space for, people of color. And so, there's a historical legacy of just like exclusion that, we're doing work, right, that there's a lot of beautiful work being done right now on addressing that issue. And, I'm really happy to see that. But I think the biggest question to ask yourself, as an organizer, working for, a large, environmental organization, or even just any environmental organization, is, is your environmentalism intersectional? Like, are you pursuing justice for both the people and the planet? And, I think it's really important to understand that environmental justice is social justice and social justice is environmental justice. We both have the same end goal. And, it's clearly stating that Black and Brown communities are, bearing the brunt of, the climate crisis and environmental damage, environmental degradation. And, it's also like, like I said earlier, it's like not assuming or speaking for, a particular group. It's, make sure that you're doing the listening and you're doing the work to reach out to these communities who have been historically left out, and to really, use your platform to give platform to them, pass the mic. And like also like asking yourself, like, is the activism that I'm doing, are you making it accessible? Is it accessible? Um, and then also like to constantly evaluate your privilege and your positionality. Like, what types of privilege do I hold as an organizer? What that allow me to be an organizer, to have the time and resources to do this? What is my positionality? Like, can I speak on this issue? Am I speaking for like you? I think it's a constant, evaluation of your positionality. And, I think a lot of people fail to do that sometimes. But personally, from my own experience, I've seen a huge shift in the environmental community, at least with the groups that I've been working with for the past couple of years. I started off being, one of the only 15, probably the only 15-year-old in, the environmental group that I was working with, and, being one of the only people of color in the room. And that space felt, a little bit uncomfortable because there was no one who really reflected me. And, I didn't really feel like there was someone I could really have a conversation with because our experiences were different. So, eventually, a few years later, why I started to, build like the Youth Climate Action Summit and the youth program was to really create a space for people who looked like me, for Black and Brown people, young people, to come together and to talk about, climate change and environmental issues, and, what we could do together to, pursue this greater vision towards, a just and sustainable planet. And so, I think it's just really important to just constantly assess your positionality and, how you're doing your activism.
Thank you so much for sharing all that. And man, I know that the way that we get into it, we can go on for hours. But I appreciate you spending the time, and I would like to just really quickly lightning round. Is there anything that are there any ways that we can stay in touch, that people can find out more about you and your work and follow anything that you're doing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can follow my social media handle, Aisha.Wallace, AISHA.WALLACE. But also I'm gonna be writing or producing a podcast that explores the intersection of environmental justice, COVID-19, and on the Latino labor community. And I don't have a name for it yet, but I'll let Brady know to send out my podcast when it's finished. It's going to be a project. And I'm also going to be working on another podcast called Climate Break. and there's an Instagram account for that, just climate_break, and it's a 90-second podcast about you know, a particular climate solution that they're talking about that day, and it's out of the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment at UC Berkeley, where I'm a student. So yeah, that's all I have for keeping in touch with me. But you know, feel free to hit me up, and you know, we can have a conversation. I love to talk to, you know, anyone who's passionate about taking action. So
Very cool. All right, thank you, Aisha. It's great to talk to you as always. And I just wanted to remind folks to remember to catch our next Ocean Steward Spotlight on February 4th. This will be with Hermina Glass Hill. Oh, this is actually going to be, this is going to be March 4th, 2021. And we'll be right here on Oceana's Facebook pages, and that'll be at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Pacific Time. Thanks, everyone.